Young nurse Ethan takes on a challenging job caring for Charles Lawson, a wealthy businessman in a coma. But this isn't just another case. Ethan finds himself drawn deep into the lives of the Lawson family, where hope, doubt, and hidden wounds intertwine. When a sudden sign of life from Charles ignites a spark of hope, the family must confront old regrets and make choices that could change their lives forever. Will Ethan's belief be enough to help bring Charles back? And what secrets will the journey reveal? Watch to see how resilience, family bonds, and compassion can create miracles. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. And let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now let's begin. Ethan Carter pulled his coat tight around himself, shivering against the early November chill. Outside the towering glass hospital building, he clutched his mother's medical bills in his hand. She had been a fighter all her life, single-handedly raising him, and now it was his turn to be strong for her. Her battle with cancer had shaken them both, but the cost of treatments had drained what little they had saved. Ethan knew he needed something more, a chance to keep her alive, whatever it took. A classmate had mentioned an opening at the Lawson estate, a live-in position for a wealthy comatose patient. The pay was more than he could have imagined, and if he could hold on to the job, more than enough to support his mother. As he stared up at the towering glass and steel exterior of the Lawson family's penthouse, Ethan felt an intense mix of anxiety and determination. This was a world entirely unfamiliar to him, but he was determined to make it work. Inside the opulent penthouse, Ethan's footsteps echoed on the marble floors. Persian rugs, elaborate oil paintings, and polished mahogany furniture surrounded him, making him feel as if he had stepped into a museum rather than a home. An ornate crystal chandelier hung from the high ceiling, casting a dim, almost ghostly light on the scene. It was cold, luxurious, but distant. He glanced down at his uniform, slightly frayed at the edges, and smoothed his collar. He had barely enough time to finish his last clinical rotation before rushing over here, and the wrinkles in his shirt made him painfully aware of how out of place he looked. Ethan's gaze drifted to a family portrait on the wall. He recognized Charles Lawson, a tall, dignified-looking man in his early 60s, standing beside his children. The intensity in his eyes seemed to burn even through the photo. Ethan wondered what had put such tension between Charles's son and daughter, a divide he would soon discover. A door swung open sharply. Julia Lawson, Charles's daughter, entered the room with a confident stride, her heels clicking on the marble. She was striking, with sharply defined features and a demeanor that exuded control and confidence. Her eyes narrowed as she took in Ethan, and he straightened, feeling the weight of her gaze. "You must be Ethan Carter, the new nurse." Her voice was crisp, almost mechanical, as if rehearsed. "Yes, Ms. Lawson. It's a pleasure to be here." He extended his hand, but she ignored it, her gaze fixed on his face as if trying to read his intentions. Julia crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "My father's condition is sensitive and I won't tolerate any disruptions. Your job is simple. Follow Dr. Hayes's instructions to the letter, avoid any speculation about his condition, and stay out of family matters." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't a job to be taken lightly, and Julia Lawson's demeanor left no room for misunderstanding. As Julia led him down a long hallway, Ethan noticed the artwork lining the walls. It seemed almost ironic that a man so full of life's luxuries would be confined to a bed, reliant on machines and strangers to keep him alive. Julia stopped at the door to the master suite, and Ethan followed her in. The room was more like a personal hospital ward than a bedroom, equipped with monitors for stands and ventilators humming rhythmically. At the center of it all lay Charles Lawson, his once commanding presence now reduced to a frail, motionless figure on the bed. Tubes and wires ran from his body to various machines, each beep and click underscoring the fragility of life. For a moment, Ethan felt a profound sadness. Here was a man who had seemingly controlled his world, now trapped and powerless. "He's been in this state for months," Julia said, her voice cold yet tinged with something Ethan couldn't quite decipher. "The doctors have their opinions, but as long as I'm in charge, he stays on life support. The determination in her voice was unwavering. But Ethan sensed a flicker of vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. Despite her assertiveness, she was clearly grappling with something profound. Julia gave him a long, assessing look before stepping back, leaving him alone with Charles and the steady hum of the machines. As Ethan began his work, checking monitors and recording vital signs, he couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility pressing down on him. Every beep of the machines seemed to remind him of his mother, lying in her own hospital bed, relying on him. Charles's presence was both imposing and inspiring, and Ethan found himself speaking softly to him, as he would with any patient. "I don't know if you can hear me, Mr. Lawson," he whispered, adjusting a pillow, "but I'll do everything I can to take care of you." Each day followed a routine, punctuated by Julia's brief, curt visits and Ethan's quiet efforts to connect with Charles, despite his unresponsive state. The stillness of the room was at once oppressive and comforting, a reminder of the fragility and resilience of life. One evening, as Ethan was recording Charles's vitals, he noticed something strange, a subtle twitch in Charles's hand. He stared at it, hardly daring to believe what he had seen. Was it a reflex? A muscle spasm? He leaned closer, watching intently, his heart pounding. "Mr. Lawson, if you can hear me, please move your hand again," Ethan whispered, feeling both foolish and hopeful. But Charles remained still, as if the moment had passed. Ethan shook his head, dismissing it as an anomaly, yet the memory of that movement stayed with him. He couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more, something worth hoping for. The next day, Ethan was introduced to Ryan Lawson, Charles's son. Ryan was different from Julia, more open, warmer. He greeted Ethan with a firm handshake and a look of gratitude. "Thank you for caring for my father, Ethan," he said, his voice laced with emotion. "It's been hard seeing him like this." Ethan felt a bond forming between them, both men drawn together by a shared sense of hope and compassion. Ryan seemed to hold on to the belief that his father could recover, even when the odds were against him. "I think there might still be something there," Ethan confided in a low voice, feeling a spark of hope. He'll move his hand the other night. "It might have been a reflex, but I can't shake the feeling it meant something." Ryan's eyes lit up. "Thank you, Ethan. Just knowing that someone else hasn't given up means a lot." When Julia found out about Ethan's conversation with Ryan, her reaction was swift and harsh. She confronted Ethan in the hallway, her eyes flashing with anger. "I told you to avoid giving my brother false hope," she snapped. "You're here to do a job, not to stir up fantasies." Ethan held her gaze, resisting the urge to back down. "I understand your concerns, Ms. Lawson, but I believe it's important to hold on to hope, even if the chances are slim. Isn't that what makes us human?" Julia scoffed, dismissing his words. "Hope can be dangerous, Mr. Carter. It makes people blind to reality. Stick to your duties, or you'll find yourself without a job." Despite Julia's warning, Ethan continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose. Each day, he sat by Charles's side, talking to him, reading the news aloud, and even playing soft music on his phone. One night, alone in the quiet room, Ethan felt an inexplicable connection to Charles, as if he were reaching beyond the silence. The beeps of the monitors and the rhythmic hum of the ventilator became a kind of dialogue, a reminder that Charles was still there, still fighting. "Whatever happens, Mr. Lawson," Ethan whispered, "I'll be here. I'll be here until the end." A week later, Ethan noticed another subtle change. Charles's eyes fluttered for a brief moment, the tiniest of movements, but enough to confirm Ethan's belief that he wasn't just imagining things. It was a glimmer, a sliver of hope that perhaps Charles was aware, trapped within his unresponsive body. Ethan knew the battle ahead would be challenging, with Julia's skepticism, Dr. Hayes's medical pragmatism, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility on his shoulders. But as he sat beside Charles that night, Ethan felt a quiet, unshakable faith blossoming within him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it, for Charles, for Ryan, and for his own mother. That night, alone in the room, Ethan found himself listening to the steady hum of the machines with an almost reverent attention. His days were a whirl of stress and obligation, torn between his job here and frequent visits to his mother's hospital room. But with Charles, alone in the quiet, he found a strange sense of purpose. "Mr. Lawson, I don't know if you can hear me," he whispered, barely audible above the sound of the ventilator. "But if there's any part of you still fighting, just know that you're not alone." Ethan often stayed late, recording his observations, keeping careful track of any slight twitch or flicker. And in those long, lonely hours, he couldn't help but feel connected to the man lying there, frozen between life and the unknown. The effort he put into caring for Charles somehow helped him face his mother's illness. It reminded him of the importance of hope, even if it seemed irrational. One morning, while adjusting Charles's pillow, Ethan thought he saw something, a subtle shift in Charles's expression, like the shadow of a smile. He blinked, wondering if he had imagined it, but the warmth that rose within him was real. He placed a hand on Charles's shoulder, overcome with a sense of determination. "You're in there, aren't you?" he said softly. "I don't know how, but I can feel it." Julia interrupted his moment of reverie, entering the room with her usual purposeful stride. She raised an eyebrow, catching Ethan's gaze on her father. "Mr. Carter, if you're done here, we need to discuss some boundaries," she said briskly. She gestured for him to follow her into the hallway, where she leveled a stern gaze at him. "My brother might find comfort in your optimism, but I want to remind you that we're here to provide medical care, not miracles." Ethan felt a surge of defensiveness. "I understand, Ms. Lawson, but it doesn't hurt to show him kindness, does it? What if it's helping in ways we can't measure?" Julia's expression softened for just a moment, but she quickly reasserted her professional mask. "Kindness is fine, but keep it professional, Mr. Carter." With that, she turned on her heel, leaving Ethan feeling a renewed sense of responsibility toward Charles, and a little frustration with Julia. The next day, while organizing Charles's medications, Ethan was surprised by a gentle knock at the door. A young woman entered, balancing a small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. She introduced herself as Emily, a family friend who had known Charles for years. "I heard you've been taking care of him," Emily said with a warm smile. "I just wanted to thank you. Charles was always so full of life. It's been hard to see him like this." Ethan could sense the deep care Emily felt for Charles. They spoke for a while, sharing memories and quiet laughter. Emily's presence brought a new light into the room, and Ethan felt encouraged by her support. He promised to let her know if there was any sign of change. As she left, Ethan found himself replaying her words in his mind. For the first time, he felt as if he were part of something bigger, a network of people who cared deeply for Charles and were rooting for his recovery. One evening, after a long day, Ethan sat by Charles's bed, recounting a story from his own life, the kind of thing he often shared with his mother to keep her spirits up. He spoke softly, not expecting any response, but letting the words flow. To his amazement, as he spoke, he noticed Charles's eyelids flicker, a slight but undeniable reaction. Ethan leaned closer, barely daring to breathe. "Charles," he whispered, using his patient's first name for the first time, "if you can hear me, please give me a sign." Though Charles's face remained impassive, the flicker of his eyelids and the tension in his brow seemed to communicate a struggle, a fierce battle to reach out. Just then, Ryan entered, his eyes widening as he saw Ethan and his father. Ethan quickly described what he had witnessed, excitement coursing through him. Ryan's face lit up, his voice trembling with hope. "Dad, if you're there, just hang on a little longer. We're waiting for you." Ryan's hope only reinforced Ethan's own, but he knew he had to tread carefully. He couldn't make promises he couldn't keep. Days later, Dr. Leonard Hayes arrived to conduct a routine examination. Ethan observed from the corner of the room, watching the doctor's practiced, efficient movements. Dr. Hayes was methodical, as though he had repeated these steps countless times. Ethan hesitated, then spoke up. "Dr. Hayes, I know it might sound far-fetched, but I've seen what could be signs of responsiveness. Flickers, small movements. They're subtle, but they feel real." The doctor looked at him, a shadow of empathy crossing his face before he shook his head. "I've seen families cling to small changes, interpreting them as signs of hope. I advise you to be cautious, Ethan. You're young. In this field, we must be careful not to impose our desires onto the patient." Ethan's face flushed. I understand, but shouldn't we at least entertain the possibility? Dr. Hayes gave him a solemn look. This line of work is as much about limits as it is about hope. Don't lose your compassion, Ethan, but remember to keep your balance. Despite his frustration, Ethan appreciated the advice. Yet he couldn't help but feel a strong instinct driving him to keep trying, no matter what the data said. Later that evening, Ethan overheard a heated exchange between Julia and Ryan in the hallway. Their voices were low, but the tension was palpable. You're just holding on because you can't face the truth, Julia hissed. We have to prepare ourselves. Dr. Hayes has made it clear. There's almost no chance. Ryan's voice cracked. So, we just give up? We're his children, Julia. Don't we owe him at least a sliver of hope? Ethan wanted to step in, to diffuse the anger that seemed to radiate between them. He could see the pain in both of their faces, and it pained him to know they were going through this. After the argument, Ryan found Ethan and expressed his appreciation, explaining the decades of tension between himself and Julia. She's always been like this, the logical one, the realist, he said, bitterness lacing his words. But I can't let her give up on Dad. Not yet. Ethan nodded, feeling the pressure of his responsibility mounting. He knew Ryan was depending on him to be a beacon of hope, and he was beginning to feel a certain loyalty, not just to Charles, but to the whole Lawson family. Ethan found himself on another late-night shift, reading to Charles from a news article. He wasn't sure if it helped, but he liked to think that some part of Charles was comforted by the sound. But tonight felt different. Ethan was exhausted, and the loneliness of the job was starting to weigh on him. As he finished reading, he noticed something. Charles's fingers twitching, small but definite movements, almost rhythmic. Ethan felt a rush of adrenaline, holding his breath to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Charles, he whispered, leaning closer. If you can hear me, please do it again. The fingers stopped moving, and Ethan's heart sank. But as he reached out to adjust the four, Charles's hand moved again, grazing Ethan's fingers. It was faint but unmistakable. Ethan stayed still, his pulse racing, as he realized that this was no mere reflex. He felt an intense, almost painful sense of gratitude, and his voice came out in a strained whisper. You're still in there, aren't you? He said. We'll find a way to bring you back. I won't give up on you. The next morning, Ethan wrestled with his thoughts. Part of him wanted to tell Julia and Ryan, to show them that there was real hope. But another part of him worried about how they would react, especially Julia, who had made her doubts about his hopeful perspective painfully clear. As he sat in the lounge, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, he was torn. He could sense the heavy expectations on him, from both siblings and from Dr. Hayes. But he couldn't ignore what he had seen. What he felt was a genuine connection with Charles. Ethan resolved to remain silent, at least for now. He would gather more evidence, watch for more signs. He couldn't risk bringing false hope to Ryan or inciting anger from Julia. For now, he would carry the weight alone. When he returned to the room, he found Ryan waiting for him, looking anxious and hopeful. Any news? Ryan asked, his eyes full of expectation. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. I think there might be something. I don't want to say too much just yet, but please know that I haven't lost hope. Ryan gave him a grateful smile, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Thank you, Ethan. I know this is hard on you too, but just knowing you're in his corner, believing, it means a lot. The weight on Ethan's shoulders felt a little lighter. His conviction was no longer his alone. He had an ally. Together, they would hold on, despite the doubts and the daunting reality of Charles's condition. As the days continued, Ethan kept a close vigil. He spoke to Charles, read aloud, and even began playing the piano in the corner of the room, something he'd learned in his youth and now used as a bridge to connect with the unresponsive man. Each note filled the room with warmth, and as he played, Ethan felt as if he were reaching beyond the veil, inviting Charles back into the world. He was no longer just a nurse. He was an advocate, a voice reminding Charles that he wasn't alone. With each small flicker and faint sound, Ethan's conviction grew, even as Julia's skepticism deepened. The emotional pull of the job, his devotion to Charles, and his friendship with Ryan gave Ethan a newfound purpose. And though the journey was far from over, He knew he wouldn't give up, not until he had done everything in his power to bring Charles back. Days turned into weeks, and the penthouse became both a home and a prison for Ethan. With each passing day, he felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. At every shift, he scrutinized every slight movement in Charles's eyes and hands, wondering if he was merely imagining things or witnessing the first hints of recovery. One night, after adjusting Charles's fore, Ethan leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "I know you're in there, Mr. Lawson. Just keep fighting, all right? We're here, waiting for you." In the silence, he imagined a flicker of response in Charles's eyes, and for a moment, hope burned brightly within him. But when the silence settled back in, his doubts returned, nagging at him. Was he truly seeing signs, or had he allowed his desire to bring Charles back to cloud his judgment? Ethan's late nights and unspoken vigil didn't go unnoticed. Ryan, who frequently checked in, sensed the growing weariness in Ethan's face. "You've been spending so much time here, Ethan," Ryan observed one evening. "Are you sure it's not taking a toll on you? This is a lot to carry alone." Ethan managed a weak smile. "I won't lie, it's tough, but I believe Charles is in there. I know it sounds strange, but I can't shake the feeling that he's fighting to come back." Ryan's eyes softened with gratitude, but Ethan noticed a flicker of doubt on Ryan's face. The young nurse felt a pang of concern. If Ryan's hope wavered, he would truly be alone in his belief. Still, he couldn't let his conviction falter, not now. One quiet morning, Ethan noticed something extraordinary. Charles's hand clenched briefly, fingers curling around the bedsheet. The movement was so deliberate that Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a random spasm. It was a choice, a conscious decision. Ethan gently touched Charles's hand. "Charles, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand." Charles's fingers twitched, a light, tentative squeeze, as though testing the boundaries of his physical form. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew he had to tell Ryan, but feared what Julia might do if she found out. The decision weighed heavily on him. This time he had to have proof. Ethan spent hours trying to capture the movements on camera, hoping to show that Charles's responses were intentional. But each time he tried, the movements seemed to stop, leaving him frustrated and disheartened. Later that evening, Julia entered Charles's room, her presence like a cold gust of wind. She immediately noticed the strain on Ethan's face. "Mr. Carter, you look exhausted. Maybe you should reconsider taking time off," Julia said, her voice sharp. Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I believe Charles is responsive. It may seem impossible, but I've seen signs. It could mean he's more aware than we realize." Julia's eyes hardened. "You're here to do a job, not to indulge in fantasies. Don't get my brother's hopes up with unfounded claims. We've had false hopes before." The sting of her words echoed in the silent room. Ethan felt a surge of frustration. "With all due respect, Ms. Lawson, I don't think hope is something we should shut out. What if he's trying to communicate, and we're too busy doubting to see it?" Julia's face betrayed a flash of emotion, but she quickly shut it down. "Stick to your duties, Mr. Carter. I don't want my family dragged into baseless hopes. If you keep pushing this, there will be consequences." After she left, Ethan felt deflated but resolved. He had to find a way to show Julia what he had seen, to make her believe, for Charles's sake. After Julia's harsh words, Ethan found solace in confiding with Ryan. That evening, they sat in the lounge, talking quietly. Ryan's face was drawn, filled with worry, and Ethan felt an overwhelming need to reassure him. "I don't know what Julia's told you, but I genuinely believe there's more going on with your father than what we're seeing on the monitors," Ethan said. Ryan nodded slowly. "Thank you, Ethan. It's just, I know Julia's logical, but sometimes her logic feels like giving up." Ethan rested a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "I think she's scared, Ryan. Sometimes hope feels like a risk." Ryan's gaze hardened with determination. "Then we'll hold on to hope for both of us. I'll talk to her, try to make her understand. She needs to see that there's still a chance." They both felt a renewed sense of purpose, promising to keep trying, even if the odds were against them. A few days later, Ethan witnessed something miraculous. As he spoke softly to Charles, recounting a recent soccer game to keep him engaged. Charles's eyes opened briefly, just for a fraction of a second. It happened so quickly that Ethan barely had time to react, but the moment stayed with him, igniting a surge of hope. He shared this with Ryan, who listened with rapt attention, a spark of belief in his eyes. "Do you think he's coming back to us?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. "I do. It may take time, but I truly believe he's in there, fighting to reach us." They both agreed to keep this between them, knowing that telling Julia without concrete proof could backfire. But for Ethan, that brief moment was all the proof he needed to keep going. Over the next few days, Ethan's resolve intensified, but so did his desperation. He spent every spare moment by Charles's side, talking, reading, and even bringing in a small radio to play Charles's favorite jazz tunes. Each song seemed to soothe the room, filling it with warmth and memories of a life still lived. Ethan's own exhaustion grew, and he found himself drifting between shifts, pulling late nights and early mornings, pushing his own limits. In those moments, he confided in Charles, sharing stories from his own life, his hopes and fears. Though Charles lay still, Ethan felt as though he was listening, absorbing every word. Julia noticed Ethan's increased presence in her father's room and confronted him again. "Mr. Carter, this is becoming obsessive," Julia warned. "You're exhausting yourself over things that, medically, we can't even verify." Ethan met her gaze, his tone calm but firm. "Your father deserves every chance, Ms. Lawson. If there's any possibility that he's still here, I have to believe in it. And I think, deep down, you do too." Julia's expression wavered for a moment before she regained her composure. "You're making a mistake if you think hope alone can change the facts." But Ethan sensed something new, a glint of doubt perhaps in her eyes. A few days later, in a quiet moment when he thought no one was watching, Charles's fingers brushed against Ethan's hand with a deliberate force, stronger than any movement before. The contact was brief, but it electrified Ethan, filling him with a powerful resolve. He knew now, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Charles was aware and struggling to communicate. This was the confirmation he had been waiting for, and it drove him to tears, a mixture of relief and determination. "Mr. Lawson," Ethan whispered, "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever it takes, we'll bring you back." After sharing this latest incident with Ryan, he and Ethan decided it was time to approach Julia together. They found her in the lounge, reviewing documents with a furrowed brow. "Julia," Ryan began, his voice steady but pleading, "we need to talk about Dad. Ethan's seen things, signs that he's still with us. I think it's time we start believing." Julia looked between them, her expression guarded. "Do you realize what you're asking? These signs you keep seeing. How can you be certain they're not just wishful thinking?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I know it sounds far-fetched, but these are real, Julia. We're not asking you to believe blindly. We're asking you to give your father the benefit of the doubt." Julia's face softened, but she remained resolute. "I'll agree to let you continue, Ethan. But if I hear one more instance of what I consider to be dangerous speculation, we'll be forced to end this." Though her words were stern, Ethan sensed a shift. She was willing to give them a chance, however reluctantly. A week later, Ethan and Ryan were keeping vigil late at night, watching for any signs of consciousness. Ethan began softly recounting a family story he'd overheard from Emily, hoping it would spark a memory. As he spoke, Charles's hand moved again, this time with unmistakable intention, curling around Ethan's fingers in a firm grasp. Ethan's voice faltered, and he looked to Ryan, whose eyes were wide with shock. "Dad," Ryan choked, barely able to contain his emotion. For a brief moment, Charles's eyes opened fully, locking onto Ethan's with an intensity that took his breath away. It was the clearest sign yet, a moment that left no room for doubt. Julia entered just then, her face pale as she took in the scene. She looked from her father to Ethan, her expression shifting from shock to a fierce mixture of hope and disbelief. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken emotions, as all three realized that Charles was indeed fighting his way back to them. Ethan's late nights in the penthouse grew longer as he waited for any flicker of movement from Charles, documenting each one meticulously. But the stress of keeping these signs to himself weighed heavily on him. He wrestled with whether to tell Julia about the small responses he'd noticed or to continue confiding only in Ryan. One evening, Emily, the family friend, visited and noticed the exhaustion on Ethan's face. "You're here a lot, aren't you?" she observed with gentle concern. Ethan nodded. "I can't explain it, but I just feel like he's still with us. Every time I think it's impossible, I see something, just a flicker or small movement." Emily offered a kind smile. "Charles was always a fighter. Maybe you're right, Ethan. Just be careful. Caring too much has a way of pulling you in deeper than you realize." As he watched her leave, her words echoed in his mind. He felt the subtle warning behind them, but he couldn't shake the connection he felt to Charles's silent struggle. He was in too deep to turn back now. A few days later, Julia arranged a meeting with Dr. Hayes. She invited Ethan to join, suspecting he might have questions as well. Dr. Hayes, experienced and compassionate, explained Charles's condition again, detailing how limited awareness was possible, but recovery was unlikely. Julia's eyes flashed with frustration as she glanced at Ethan. "I respect Mr. Carter's dedication, but I worry that all this hope might be blinding us to reality." Ethan took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I understand the skepticism, but I've seen movements that seem deliberate. I believe Charles is responding in small ways." Dr. Hayes looked at Ethan thoughtfully. "In medicine, especially in complex cases like this, we often walk a fine line between hope and pragmatism. I encourage you to keep an open mind, Julia, but proceed with caution." Julia nodded, though her expression remained strained. As they left the meeting, Ethan sensed her tension building, but he also felt a renewed determination. Dr. Hayes's cautious encouragement was all the reassurance he needed to keep trying. That night, Ethan found himself by Charles's bedside once more, feeling the strain of the work. He thought of his mother, who was still in her own hospital bed, fighting her own illness. The parallels between his mother's struggle and Charles's silent resilience struck him deeply. "Mr. Lawson," he murmured softly, "I'm doing this for you, but I'm also doing it for her. I know how hard it is to feel like you're fighting alone." His voice wavered, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge just how much this job meant to him personally. It was more than a job. It was a mission to save one life, even as he felt powerless to help his own family. As he gathered his strength and resumed his nightly vigil, he noticed a subtle twitch in Charles's hand. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he leaned closer, his hope rekindled. "Just keep holding on," he whispered. "We're going to get through this." Ryan arrived early the next morning, and Ethan shared the latest movements he'd observed. Ryan's face lit up with hope, and he sat beside his father, speaking softly to him. "Dad, Ethan thinks he saw you move again. I don't know if you can hear me, but we're here. We're not giving up." Ethan saw the relief in Ryan's face and felt the weight of his own commitment deepen. He wasn't just supporting Charles. He was also the bridge of hope between Ryan and his father. Ryan's loyalty fueled Ethan's determination, but the silence they maintained around Julia was beginning to feel like a lie. And yet, as he watched the look of belief in Ryan's eyes, he knew he couldn't back down now. That afternoon, while adjusting Charles's pillows and speaking softly to him, Ethan felt Charles's fingers close around his own. It was brief, but deliberate, enough to send a surge of excitement through him. "Mr. Lawson," Ethan breathed, "I know you're in there." He held onto Charles's hand, heart pounding. The fleeting grasp felt like a message, a silent reassurance that Charles was still fighting. As he documented the movement in his notes, he wondered if he should finally show Julia, knowing this could be the evidence she needed. But his hesitation held him back. Until he could be sure, he feared risking her wrath and skepticism. For now, this small miracle was his own secret, a tiny victory in the ongoing battle. Days passed, and Julia grew increasingly suspicious of Ethan's long hours and whispered conversations with Ryan. She found him one evening by her father's bedside, his hand resting on Charles's in a gesture of silent support. "Mr. Carter," she said sharply, her tone laced with irritation, I think it's time we addressed your extra efforts. You've been spending more time here than necessary, and I need to know why." Ethan met her gaze evenly, choosing his words carefully. "Ms. Lawson, I've seen signs of responsiveness. Small things, but enough to give me hope. I'm here because I believe your father is still with us." Julia's expression hardened. "This isn't a fairy tale, Mr. Carter. My father isn't some lost soul waiting for a miracle. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment." Ethan felt a flash of anger, but kept his tone measured. "Hope is what keeps us going, Ms. Lawson. And I think, deep down, you know he's still fighting." She said nothing, but Ethan noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she looked at her father. Without another word, she left the room, leaving Ethan to wonder if he'd finally made her question her resolve. The following night, as Ethan sat by Charles's bedside, he decided to try something different. He played one of Charles's favorite jazz songs on his phone, letting the soft melody fill the room. For a while, he simply sat there, hoping the music would stir something within the man lying silently in the bed. To his amazement, Charles's eyelids flickered, and his lips parted slightly. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his hand trembling as he leaned closer. "Charles," he whispered, his heart racing. "If you can hear me, give me any sign. Move your hand, blink, anything." There was a long pause, and just as Ethan was about to lose hope, Charles's eyes opened ever so briefly. It was only a second, but in that moment, Ethan felt as though the whole world had shifted. He watched, frozen in awe, as Charles's eyes focused on him with an intensity that was unmistakable. This wasn't a random reflex, this was a response. Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. The next day, Ethan shared the breakthrough with Ryan. The news brought Ryan to tears, and he gripped Ethan's hand, a fierce gratitude shining in his eyes. "You don't know what this means to me, Ethan," Ryan said, his voice choked. I thought we had lost him forever." Ethan felt the weight of Ryan's faith in him, a faith that mirrored his own. But there was also a growing tension, the knowledge that Julia would likely resist any talk of hope until she could see it with her own eyes. For now, though, they agreed to keep this breakthrough between them, feeling a cautious optimism that Charles was inching closer to full awareness. That evening, while sitting with Charles, Ethan felt the urge to push his luck. He spoke to Charles as he would a friend, recounting memories he'd heard from Ryan, as well as some of his own stories. As he spoke, he felt Charles's fingers twitch again, and when he looked up, he saw something that nearly brought him to his knees. Charles's eyes opened, wide and focused, staring directly at him with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Ethan whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Charles, can you hear me?" In response, Charles's lips parted, and he let out a faint, guttural sound. It wasn't a word, but it was enough to send a wave of emotion crashing over Ethan. This was real, undeniable. Ryan, who had come to the doorway, saw the interaction and let out a quiet gasp, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, you're really here," he whispered. At that moment, Julia entered, catching the scene unfolding in front of her. She stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of her father, conscious and aware, reaching out with his gaze. She approached slowly, her voice trembling. "Dad, is that really you?" Charles's fingers moved slightly, acknowledging her presence. The disbelief on Julia's face was gradually replaced by a fierce, overwhelming hope. In that moment, all three of them felt the undeniable truth. Charles was fighting his way back to them, one small step at a time. In the days following Charles's first deliberate response, Julia found herself lingering more in her father's room. She watched him intently, searching for any further signs of life. She began to question her firm stance against hope, unable to ignore the possibility that her father was fighting to come back. One morning, she approached Ethan in the hallway, her expression guarded yet softened. "Mr. Carter, the other night, when my father opened his eyes, that wasn't a reflex, was it?" Ethan met her gaze, a mixture of empathy and resolve in his eyes. "No, Ms. Lawson, I believe it was real. I think he's trying to communicate, to break through." Julia nodded, her face conflicted. "I don't want to be swept away by false hope, Ethan, but if he's really in there, I need to know for sure." Her words held a vulnerability Ethan hadn't seen before, and he recognized it as the first crack in her wall of disbelief. To confirm Charles's progress, Julia scheduled an appointment with Dr. Hayes, inviting Ethan and Ryan to join. Dr. Hayes performed a battery of tests, measuring Charles's reflexes, responsiveness to sound, and other signs of awareness. After the examination, Dr. Hayes addressed the family, his tone cautiously neutral. "There are some unusual signs here. I can't say definitively that Charles is regaining consciousness, but these responses suggest there may be some degree of awareness." Julia's face hardened. "So, you're saying he could be conscious?" Dr. Hayes hesitated. "It's possible, but please remember, recovery from a state like this is complex. Progress may come and go." Ethan felt Julia's struggle, the internal conflict between her cautious nature and the glimmer of hope she now held. He knew that convincing her fully would be a slow process, but he felt that this was a step forward. After the doctor left, Ryan lingered by his father's bedside, unable to shake his renewed hope. He looked at Ethan, a determined smile crossing his face. "I knew it. I knew he was still in there." Ethan smiled back, feeling his own hope rekindle. "I think so too, Ryan. He's still fighting, and we're going to fight alongside him." Ryan gently held his father's hand, his voice soft. "Dad, we're right here. Don't give up, okay? We're waiting for you." Seeing Ryan's conviction made Ethan feel the weight of his responsibility even more. This was no longer just about Charles's life. It was about restoring a family's faith and hope. Julia found herself unable to sleep that night. The faint sounds of jazz music drifted through the walls as Ethan played one of Charles's favorite songs on the small radio. Unable to resist, Julia entered the room, watching Ethan as he spoke softly to her father. "Mr. Carter," Julia said quietly, startling Ethan. "Do you always play his music?" Ethan nodded. "Sometimes music stirs memories. It's a way to reach people, even when words can't." Julia approached the bed, looking down at her father's still face. "Do you really believe he can hear it?" "Yes, Ms. Lawson. I believe he can hear us, even if he can't respond the way we'd like." Julia sat beside her father, her hand resting gently on his. She didn't say anything, but her presence beside him spoke volumes. It was the first time Ethan had seen her so vulnerable, the hardened skeptic beginning to soften. Over the next few days, Julia's fragile hope clashed with her pragmatic instincts. As she watched Ethan interact with her father, she felt torn between the desire to believe and the fear of being disappointed. One evening, Julia confronted Ethan. "You're putting my family through a lot, Ethan. If you're wrong, we're all going to suffer for it." Ethan met her gaze, his voice calm but resolute. "With all due respect, Ms. Lawson, your father deserves a chance. Even if it's difficult, hope is worth the risk." Julia sighed, her expression weary. "You have no idea how much I've lost, Mr. Carter. Believing is hard for me because I'm afraid." Ethan felt a pang of empathy for her. Maybe this is one of those times when believing is all we have. Julia didn't respond but seemed to take his words to heart, her face softened by a mix of exhaustion and hope. As the days passed, Charles's movements became more consistent, his responses gradually growing stronger. Ryan and Ethan documented each small milestone, eye movements, subtle gestures, even a faint attempt to nod. They kept a log, carefully recording every sign of progress, creating a tangible record that Ethan hoped would eventually persuade Julia to fully embrace the reality of Charles's recovery. Late one night, as Ethan sat alone with Charles, he leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "You're doing great, Mr. Lawson. Don't give up. We're here, waiting for you." For the first time, Charles's fingers pressed against Ethan's hand with enough force to leave no doubt. Ethan smiled, feeling the power of that small gesture. It was more than just a response. It was a message. As Charles's responses grew more frequent, Julia began to spend more time by his side. She watched, her expression a mixture of awe and fear, as her father seemed to respond to her voice, even managing a faint smile one afternoon. It was a turning point for Julia. That evening, she gathered the family, her voice shaking as she addressed them. I think we have a real chance. Dad is showing signs. He's still with us." Ryan hugged her, relief flooding his face. Ethan felt his own heart swell, realizing that they were all beginning to believe, despite the risks. It was a fragile, beautiful moment, a family coming together for the first time in years. But as often happens, progress didn't come without setbacks. A few days later, Charles suddenly went silent, his responses disappearing as quickly as they had begun. The family's hope was shaken, and tension rose as they struggled to make sense of the setback. Julia took the news hardest. She confronted Ethan, her face tight with frustration. "You told us he was improving, Mr. Carter. You promised us hope." Ethan's heart ached, but he remained steady. "Recovery isn't a straight line, Ms. Lawson. There will be ups and downs, but we can't give up now. He's come too far." Julia's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Ethan saw the depth of her pain. "I don't know if I can take this, Ethan. Watching him fight, seeing him slip away, it's too much." Ethan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Julia. And so is he. We just have to hold on." Ryan, too, was shaken by his father's sudden setback. One night, he sat alone with Charles, pouring out his heart in a way he hadn't done in years. "Dad, I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to keep fighting. You're my hero, and I can't lose you. Please don't leave us." Ethan, standing quietly in the doorway, felt a lump form in his throat. He knew that Charles's recovery was more than a medical journey. It was a healing process for the family, each of them grappling with their own pain and hope. Late one night, as Ethan sat with Charles, he noticed something extraordinary. Charles's eyes were open, and he was looking directly at him. Ethan's heart raced as he spoke softly, encouraging Charles to respond. "Charles, if you can hear me, give us a sign." To his amazement, Charles raised his hand and placed it on Ethan's, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of the moment. Charles was reaching out, fighting to communicate. At that moment, Julia entered, her face a mix of shock and awe. She watched, breathless, as her father's hand rested on Ethan's, a tangible sign of life and connection. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're really here." Charles's lips moved slightly, and though no sound escaped, the message was clear. He was still here, still fighting, and they would fight alongside him. Charles's recent signs of responsiveness filled the family with hope. But as the days wore on, without further breakthroughs, frustration began to seep in. Julia's cautious optimism faded, replaced by a familiar skepticism, while Ryan remained steadfast in his belief. One evening, Julia found Ethan sitting alone by her father's bed, quietly recounting a story from his own childhood. His voice was low, his tone almost reverent, as he shared personal memories, hoping they would spark something within Charles. "You're treating him like he's already awake," Julia said softly from the doorway, her voice tinged with doubt. Ethan looked up, surprised to see her. "Ms. Lawson, your father's still with us." "I'm sure of it." Julia sighed, crossing her arms. "Hope is painful, Mr. Carter, and it's fleeting. Just because he moved once doesn't mean we'll see it again." Ethan felt a pang of empathy. "I understand why you're hesitant, Julia, but he deserves our faith. Every small response shows he's trying." Julia's expression softened, but her doubts remained visible. She lingered for a moment before retreating, leaving Ethan to wonder if she'd ever truly allow herself to hope. Ryan, on the other hand, found himself more determined than ever. He visited his father's room each day, bringing stories, memories, and encouragement. His loyalty touched Ethan, but it also concerned him. Ryan's unwavering faith could turn to devastation if Charles's progress stalled. One evening, Ethan approached Ryan, choosing his words carefully. "Ryan, I admire your hope, but you need to prepare for anything. Recovery can be unpredictable." Ryan looked up, his face set with determination. "Dad wouldn't give up on me. I'm not giving up on him." Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of respect. "Then we'll keep fighting together. But I want you to take care of yourself too." This is a long journey. Ryan's face softened. Thanks, Ethan. You're the only one who gets it. I just wish Julia would see what we see. As they both looked toward Charles, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing they would need every ounce of strength to get through the difficult days ahead. The news of Charles's sporadic responsiveness began to reach close family friends and business associates, sparking a wave of unsolicited advice and opinions. One evening, Emily stopped by to check on Julia, her tone sympathetic yet laced with caution. I heard about Charles's progress, Emily began, glancing meaningfully at Julia. But be careful, Julia. Hope can be misleading. Julia's face tightened. I know, Emily, but it's so hard to watch him like this and not feel something. Ethan and Ryan are convinced he's waking up. Emily reached out, placing a comforting hand on Julia's arm. Just don't let it consume you. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is let go. Julia nodded, though her heart felt heavier than ever. She was caught between the undeniable signs of life she'd witnessed and the fear of watching her family fall apart over empty hopes. Ethan spent every free moment by Charles's side, trying new ways to stimulate responses. He brought in more of Charles's favorite music, played recordings of the family's voices, and even read aloud from the business articles Charles used to enjoy. One afternoon, as he described a recent market update, he noticed Charles's fingers twitch again. It was faint but deliberate, and Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Mr. Lawson, if you can hear me, try moving your hand again. To his amazement, Charles's fingers flexed slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Ethan's hope alive. He documented the incident in his log, carefully noting the date and time. Knowing each small victory brought them closer to the proof Julia needed. As Ethan's efforts continued, the tension between Julia and Ryan reached a boiling point. One evening, Julia confronted her brother in their father's room, her voice low but angry. Ryan, I know you want Dad to come back, but this constant hope, it's exhausting. Ryan met her gaze, frustration simmering in his eyes. Exhausting for who, Julia? For you or for Dad? Julia's face flushed. For all of us. I don't want to watch him suffer, and I don't want to keep pretending that every twitch is some miraculous sign. Ryan shook his head. Maybe if you'd spent more time here, you'd understand. Dad isn't just a patient, he's still our father, and he needs us to believe in him. Julia's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away, her voice breaking. I don't know how much more I can take. Ethan, who had been listening from the doorway, felt the ache of their words. He knew their pain was rooted in love, but he also sensed that something deeper was keeping them apart. He vowed to find a way to bridge the rift between them, knowing it would be essential for Charles's recovery. Late that night, Julia sat alone beside her father, her emotions swirling. She reached out, taking his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm scared of getting my hopes up, scared of losing you all over again. For the first time, Julia allowed herself to speak freely, sharing her fears and regrets, her hopes and doubts. As she poured out her heart, she noticed a subtle movement. Her father's fingers pressed gently against hers. Julia's breath caught, and tears filled her eyes. She looked up at Ethan, who had been watching from across the room, his expression one of encouragement. Maybe you're right, Ethan, she murmured. Maybe he is still here. Ethan approached, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. I think he's been waiting for you to believe it too. Just as hope began to grow stronger within the family, a medical complication arose. Charles developed a sudden respiratory infection, causing his oxygen levels to plummet. The family watched in horror as the medical team rushed to stabilize him, the machines beeping urgently. The ordeal left them shaken, and even Ryan struggled to keep his faith. Julia, devastated, turned on Ethan, her voice filled with anger and fear. Was this your idea of hope, Mr. Carter? Watching him suffer like this? Ethan took a deep breath, his own emotions raw. I didn't expect this setback, Julia. But it doesn't change what we've seen. Your father is fighting, and setbacks are part of the process. Julia shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can do this anymore. Ethan watched her leave, feeling the weight of her doubt. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he couldn't shake the belief that Charles was still fighting to return. That night, Ethan stayed with Charles, his heart heavy with guilt and fear. He leaned close, speaking softly to his patient, almost as if he were speaking to a friend. "Mr. Lawson, if you're in there, I need you to fight. Your family is breaking apart, and they need you. We all need you." As he spoke, he noticed a flicker in Charles's eyes, a faint but undeniable response. Ethan's heart raced, and he reached for Charles's hand, squeezing it gently. "Just give us one more sign, anything to show them you're still here." In response, Charles's hand tightened slightly around Ethan's, and his eyes opened, focusing on him with a clarity Ethan had never seen before. It was a powerful moment, a connection that defied explanation, a confirmation of everything Ethan had fought to believe. The next morning, Ethan shared the breakthrough with Julia, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "Your father responded again, Julia. He looked at me, really looked at me." Julia's face softened, her skepticism wavering. She looked at her father, her hand trembling as she took his. "Dad, if you're really in there, please show us. We're here, waiting for you." To her astonishment, Charles's eyes opened, and he managed a faint, deliberate blink. Julia's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her as she realized the truth. Her father was still there, fighting to come back. In the days that followed, the family rallied around Charles with renewed hope. Julia spent every free moment by his side, sharing memories and stories, while Ryan continued to offer his unwavering support. Ethan watched the family's transformation, feeling a profound sense of purpose. He knew the journey was far from over, but he believed, more than ever, that they would make it through. One evening, as they sat together in Charles's room, Ethan felt a quiet peace settle over them. This family had been fractured by doubt and fear, but they were healing, each of them finding strength in the possibility of a miracle. Charles's journey was not just a battle for life. It was a testament to the power of love, faith, and resilience. And with each small victory, they grew closer to the day when Charles would return to them fully, a day they all now believed was possible. As the days passed, Charles continued to show slow but promising improvements. Each response, no matter how small, felt monumental to the family, who rallied around him with renewed hope. Charles began to blink on command and occasionally managed a faint smile when someone told a familiar story or played his favorite music. One evening, Julia stayed late, reading aloud from one of Charles's business journals. When she paused to check his expression, she saw a glimmer of interest in his eyes, a sign that he recognized her voice and perhaps even understood her words. "Dad," she whispered, fighting back tears. "I thought I'd lost you, but you're here. You've always been here." It was a realization that brought her a sense of peace and renewed strength, knowing that even during the darkest times, her father had never truly left her. As Charles's progress grew more evident, Ethan spent a quiet night in the hospital garden, reflecting on the journey so far. The burden of the past months weighed on him, from his mother's illness to the emotional toll of caring for Charles. Yet, he felt a sense of fulfillment he'd never experienced before. "Mom," he whispered to himself, picturing her face. "I wish you could see this. I'm fighting for him, like I want someone to fight for you." The wind rustled the leaves, and Ethan felt a quiet sense of reassurance, as if his mother's presence was there with him, guiding him. He returned to Charles's room with renewed determination, more committed than ever to see the journey through. With Charles showing signs of improvement, Julia felt a new burden lift. Her skepticism and resistance had shielded her from heartbreak, but they had also distanced her from her family. Seeking to make amends, she approached Ethan one evening, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Ethan, I owe you an apology," she began, her voice hesitant. "I was too guarded, too afraid to hope. But you never gave up, not on my father or on us. Thank you for everything." Ethan looked at her, a quiet warmth in his gaze. "There's nothing to apologize for, Julia. We were all just trying to protect ourselves in our own ways." Julia smiled, feeling a newfound respect and gratitude for Ethan. She realized that his dedication had been the bridge that had kept her family together during their darkest moments. As Charles's condition continued to improve, Ryan found himself reflecting on his father's influence. Charles had always been his hero, guiding him and encouraging him to follow his own path. Now, as he watched his father fight his way back, Ryan felt inspired to give back. He began volunteering at the hospital's rehabilitation center, working with patients recovering from various traumas. His time there gave him a newfound purpose, allowing him to channel his emotions and his desire to help others. One afternoon, he shared his experience with Ethan. "Being here, seeing others fight to regain their lives, it's helping me heal too. I think Dad would be proud." Ethan smiled, feeling a sense of pride in Ryan's transformation. They had both been changed by Charles's journey, finding new strength in themselves through his resilience. One weekend, Julia arranged a small gathering for close family and friends in Charles's hospital room, filling the space with familiar faces and cherished memories. The room was decorated with family photos, and Ethan brought in fresh flowers, making the sterile hospital environment feel warm and inviting. As each guest shared a favorite memory of Charles, Julia, Ryan, and Ethan noticed how Charles's eyes brightened, a faint smile on his face as he listened to stories of love, laughter, and friendship. For the first time in months, the room was filled with laughter and warmth, a testament to the power of love and community. At the end of the evening, Julia whispered to her father, "We're all here for you, Dad. Whenever you're ready to come back, we're waiting." Just as Charles's recovery seemed to be on a steady path, a sudden complication arose. Late one night, he suffered a mild seizure, a potential setback that left the family reeling with worry. Ethan and the medical team sprang into action, working tirelessly to stabilize him. The experience was a harsh reminder of the unpredictability of recovery, and Julia's confidence wavered. Sitting beside her father, she spoke through her tears, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, Dad, don't leave us now. We need you." Ethan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his own heart heavy with worry. "He's come too far to give up now, Julia. This is just one more hurdle. We're not going to lose him." Together, they waited through the night, a silent vigil that tested their patience and their faith. When Charles stabilized the following morning, they shared a quiet moment of relief, knowing that they had faced yet another trial together. The toll of Charles's journey weighed heavily on Ethan, who had been grappling with his own family burdens throughout. His mother's condition had worsened, leaving him torn between his duty to Charles and his desire to be with her. One evening, as he sat with Charles, Ethan spoke softly, sharing his feelings. "You're like family to me, Mr. Lawson. But my mother, she's the reason I'm here. She's the one who taught me to care, to fight for people." Charles's eyes softened, as though he understood Ethan's conflict. Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if Charles's silent presence was offering him the support he so desperately needed. Charles's eyes softened, as though he understood Ethan's conflict. Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as if Charles's silent presence was offering him the support he so desperately needed. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, "for everything." One evening, as Julia and Ryan sat with their father, Charles managed to raise his hand and brush Julia's arm in a deliberate motion. The gesture was small but significant, enough to bring Julia to tears. Ryan held his father's hand, his voice choked with emotion as he spoke words of encouragement. "Dad, we're here. We've been waiting for you, and we're not going anywhere." The intensity of the moment brought the family together, their shared hope stronger than ever. They knew they still had a long road ahead, but this second breakthrough filled them with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. In the days that followed, Julia began to open up more about her past regrets and the tensions that had created distance between her and her father. One evening, she confided in Ethan, her voice filled with remorse. "I wish I'd told him sooner how much he meant to me. I let so many years pass, thinking we had all the time in the world." Ethan listened, his expression compassionate. "It's not too late, Julia. He's here, and he's still fighting. I think he knows how much you care." Julia nodded, feeling the weight of her burdens lift slightly. As she watched her father's quiet resilience, she knew it was her chance to make things right, to finally let go of the guilt she'd carried for so long. With Charles's recovery still uncertain, the family decided to channel their experiences into something meaningful. Ryan proposed creating a foundation to support families facing similar challenges, using their resources to fund research and provide emotional support. Julia, inspired by her father's determination, eagerly agreed. Together, they began laying the groundwork for the foundation, a project that symbolized their shared mission to turn their struggle into something that would benefit others. Ethan was invited to join the board, an honor he accepted with humility and pride. He knew that their journey was far from over, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing he was part of something bigger than himself. One morning, as Ethan and Julia were discussing the foundation's plans beside Charles's bed, they heard a faint sound. Turning quickly, they saw Charles's eyes open, his lips moving as he struggled to form words. Ethan leaned closer, encouraging him. "Mr. Lawson, we're here. Take your time." With effort, Charles managed to whisper, "Thank you." Julia's eyes filled with tears, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the significance of the moment. Her father was back, truly back, able to speak and convey his gratitude for the unwavering support they had shown him. Ryan rushed in, and the three of them shared an emotional embrace, overwhelmed by the miracle of Charles's return to full awareness. Their journey had been filled with heartache and doubt, but this moment made every trial worthwhile. In the weeks that followed, Charles continued to improve, his speech growing stronger, his movements more coordinated. The family celebrated each small milestone, united by the bond they had forged through their shared experience. At the foundation's launch event, Charles, with Ethan by his side, spoke publicly for the first time, sharing his gratitude and his story of resilience. His words inspired everyone in attendance, a testament to the strength of hope and the power of family. Julia, Ryan, and Ethan stood proudly beside him, knowing that their journey had come full circle. They had transformed their pain into purpose, creating a legacy that would honor their struggle and support countless others. As the applause echoed around them, Julia glanced at Ethan, her expression one of gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you, Ethan. You brought us hope when we had none left." Ethan smiled, humbled by her words. "It was your family's love that made the difference. I was just there to remind you of what you already had." With Charles now able to speak in short phrases, each word he uttered felt like a precious gift to his family. One quiet evening, while Ethan was preparing to administer medication, Charles turned his head slowly toward him. "Why help?" he whispered, his gaze searching Ethan's face. Ethan's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and humility. He leaned close, his voice soft but steady. "Because everyone deserves someone who believes in them, Mr. Lawson. And I couldn't walk away from you. I knew there was more to your story." Charles's eyes filled with a quiet understanding, and Ethan felt their bond deepen. It was a moment that cemented his role, not only as a caregiver, but as a true friend to the family. That night, as the family was preparing to leave, Charles began experiencing intense muscle spasms, a painful side effect of his condition as his body slowly reawakened. Julia and Ryan watched in horror, their father's discomfort tearing at their hearts. Despite his condition, Charles squeezed their hands, a silent reassurance that he would endure this, just as he had everything else. "Please, let us stay," Julia pleaded with the medical team, her voice breaking as she clung to her father's hand. Ethan gently stepped in, his calm presence reassuring. "Ms. Lawson, he's in good hands. We'll keep him as comfortable as possible, and I'll stay with him tonight." Julia hesitated, her face pale with worry, before finally nodding. She placed a soft kiss on her father's forehead, whispering, "I'll be back in the morning. I love you, Dad." As she and Ryan left, Ethan felt the weight of their trust and a renewed determination to make Charles's recovery as painless as possible. He adjusted the monitors, checked the medication levels, and stayed by Charles's side, offering quiet words of comfort through the long night. In the days following the incident, Ryan became even more committed to his father's progress, channeling his energy into researching new therapies and techniques that might aid his recovery. He He shared his findings with Ethan, who was impressed by Ryan's dedication and resourcefulness. One afternoon, as they reviewed a new study together, Ethan placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "You know, your father would be proud of how much you're doing for him." Ryan looked away, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want him to know he's not alone. He's always been there for me. I have to do the same for him now." Ethan nodded, feeling the sincerity in Ryan's words. Together, they forged a quiet alliance, each determined to give Charles every possible chance for recovery. Despite her father's progress, Julia struggled with guilt, haunted by memories of arguments and missed moments. She shared these feelings with Ethan one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was always so busy, always finding reasons to stay away. And now, I'd give anything to have that time back," she admitted, her eyes welling with tears. Ethan listened patiently, his expression filled with empathy. "We all carry regrets, Julia. But your father knows you're here now, and he sees how much you're doing for him. That's what matters." She looked at him, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you, Ethan. You've done more for my family than we could ever repay." Ethan gave a small smile. "Being here, watching your family come together, that's enough for me." One morning, as Julia and Ryan sat with their father, Charles looked at each of them with an intensity they hadn't seen before. He managed a faint smile, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. "Proud of you," he murmured, his words strained but unmistakable. Julia and Ryan's faces lit up with joy and relief. They leaned close, each taking one of his hands, their own voices choked with emotion. "Dad, we're proud of you too. You've shown us what it means to be strong," Ryan said softly. Julia added, "We'll never leave you, Dad. We're here every step of the way." Ethan watched from across the room, his heart swelling with pride at the family's resilience. He felt deeply moved by the love and strength they shared, knowing it was this unwavering bond that had brought Charles back to them. In a rare quiet moment, Ethan received a call from his mother's caregiver, updating him on her condition. As he listened, he felt the familiar pang of worry mixed with guilt. Though he had dedicated himself fully to Charles's recovery, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was neglecting his own family. After the call, he sat alone, reflecting on the sacrifices he'd made and the path he had chosen. His thoughts drifted to Charles, who lay sleeping nearby. In that moment, Ethan made a promise to himself to fight just as hard for his own mother's well-being, using everything he had learned from Charles's journey. Taking a deep breath, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would see Charles's recovery through to the end, but he would also find a way to support his own family. This journey had strengthened him in ways he hadn't anticipated, and he knew he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. As Charles's progress continued, a sudden complication arose. He developed a severe infection, and the medical team warned the family that his condition could deteriorate rapidly. Julia, Ryan, and Ethan were devastated, each of them fearing that their hope might have been for nothing. Ethan stayed by Charles's side throughout the night, fighting exhaustion as he monitored his condition. At one point, he leaned close, his voice a quiet plea. "Mr. Lawson, if you're still in there, we need you to keep fighting. Your family isn't ready to lose you." Julia and Ryan took turns sitting vigil, each finding strength in the other's presence. They clung to the hope that Charles would overcome this final test, believing that their father's spirit was strong enough to carry him through. Ethan stayed by Charles's side throughout the night, fighting exhaustion as he monitored his condition. At one point, he leaned close, his voice a quiet plea. "Mr. Lawson, if you're still in there, we need you to keep fighting. Your family isn't ready to lose you." Julia and Ryan took turns sitting vigil, each finding strength in the other's presence. They clung to the hope that Charles would overcome this final test, believing that their father's spirit was strong enough to carry him through. After several agonizing days, Charles's condition stabilized and the infection cleared. The family breathed a collective sigh of relief, overwhelmed with gratitude for the chance to continue their journey together. That evening, Charles opened his eyes fully for the first time since his illness began, his gaze clear and focused. He looked at Julia and Ryan, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I love you both. Thank you for never giving up on me." Julia and Ryan embraced him, their tears a mixture of relief and joy. They had come so close to losing him, but their love and perseverance had brought him back. Ethan watched the reunion, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. He knew his role in the family's journey had been more than that of a nurse. He had been a beacon of hope, a source of strength, and a reminder of the power of resilience. In the days that followed, the family discussed how they could use their experiences to help others. They decided to establish a foundation dedicated to research and support for families facing similar medical journeys, providing resources and guidance for those struggling with the uncertainties of long-term recovery. Julia, inspired by her father's strength and Ethan's dedication, took on a leadership role in the foundation, working to expand its reach and impact. Ryan contributed by offering his time and expertise, sharing his story with families in need of hope. Ethan, invited to join the board, accepted with humility, knowing that this was the culmination of all he had fought for. He had not only helped a family heal, but he had also found his own purpose in the process. On the day of the foundation's launch, Charles, still in recovery but more present than ever, spoke to a small gathering of friends, family, and supporters. With Ethan, Julia, and Ryan by his side, he shared his story of resilience, gratitude, and the love that had kept him going. "I am here today because my family believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. And because of people like Ethan, who never gave up, even in the darkest times. We are proof that no journey is too difficult when love and hope are at the heart of it." The audience erupted in applause, moved by Charles's words and the family's journey. Ethan felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had played a part in this miracle. He looked at Julia, who gave him a grateful smile, and at Ryan, whose admiration was evident. As the event drew to a close, Ethan realized that he had found a new family, a group bound by resilience, love, and a shared mission to make a difference. With Charles's recovery progressing steadily, the Lawson family threw their energy into launching the new foundation, the Lawson Hope Foundation, dedicated to supporting families and patients affected by prolonged comas and neurological recovery. The foundation's mission was simple but powerful: to provide resources, emotional support, and medical grants to families who, like them, had faced the daunting uncertainty of an extended recovery. At the foundation's official launch, Julia spoke to a small gathering of community members, family friends, and local media. "This journey taught us that even in the most challenging moments, there is hope. We're here today because we didn't give up on each other. And now we want to give that hope to others." The audience applauded, visibly moved. Charles, standing with the assistance of a cane, nodded in quiet pride at his daughter. His once distant relationship with her was now stronger than ever, and he looked forward to watching her guide the foundation with the same tenacity she had shown during his recovery. After his instrumental role in Charles's recovery, Ethan was asked to serve as the foundation's medical advisor, a position he accepted with deep gratitude. His role involved coordinating with hospitals, arranging family counseling programs, and providing educational workshops for caregivers. One afternoon, as he reviewed the foundation's new pamphlets, Julia approached him, her expression one of gratitude and admiration. "Ethan, you saved my family. You didn't just bring my father back. You reminded us how to be a family," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. Ethan looked at her, humbled. "I was just doing my job, Julia, but it means everything to me that I could help." She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than you'll ever know. This foundation, this mission, it's because of you." Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was no longer just a job or a career. It was a calling, one that had given his own life renewed purpose and meaning. Ryan, who had found solace in helping other patients and families, began traveling to speak at events, sharing his family's journey and his father's miraculous recovery. During his first speech at a local hospital, he looked out at the audience, his voice filled with the same passion that had fueled him during Charles's illness. "My father taught me what it means to fight and what it means to love. I'm here to tell you that no struggle is too big and no heartache too deep when you're surrounded by people who care. Never lose faith in those you love, no matter how hard the journey may seem. Afterward, he was approached by a young woman whose mother was in a similar condition to Charles's. Her eyes were filled with tears as she thanked him for his words. "You gave me hope when I thought I'd lost it," she said quietly. Ryan felt a sense of purpose swell within him. He had found his own way of honoring his father's strength by being a source of support for others. In the quiet of a late afternoon, Charles and Julia sat together in the garden of the rehabilitation center, enjoying the warm breeze. The two hadn't spoken at length since Charles had regained full consciousness, and Julia sensed that he had something to say. "Julia," Charles began, his voice steady but soft. "I know I wasn't always there for you when you needed me. I let work take over my life, and I missed moments I can't get back. I'm sorry." Julia, touched by his vulnerability, took his hand. "Dad, I was angry for a long time, but I realized something through all of this. You didn't give up on us. You fought to come back, to be here with us, and that means everything." Charles smiled, a warmth in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Julia. Proud of the woman you've become, and proud of how you've taken charge of this foundation. I couldn't have asked for a better legacy." They sat in comfortable silence, the unspoken forgiveness healing the wounds of the past. For the first time in years, they felt fully at peace, knowing their family bond was stronger than ever. Ethan had been caring for his mother's health through a trusted caregiver, but her condition had deteriorated over the past few months. One evening, after a long day at the foundation, Ethan received a call informing him that his mother was nearing the end. He rushed to her side, sitting beside her bed as she lay peacefully, her breathing shallow. Taking her hand, he whispered, "Mom, thank you for teaching me to be strong, to be compassionate. Because of you, I could help others. I love you." In her last moments, his mother squeezed his hand gently, a faint smile crossing her face. Ethan felt a profound sense of peace, knowing he had honored her legacy by dedicating himself to helping others. Her passing left him with a quiet strength, a reminder that his work with the Lawson family and the foundation was a way of carrying her spirit forward. Months after the foundation's launch, Julia received a letter from a family who had been one of their first recipients. They thanked the Loss and Hope Foundation for the grant that had allowed them to afford specialized care for their son, who had been in a similar condition to Charles. Reading the letter aloud in Charles's hospital room, Julia's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, you gave them hope, just like you gave us hope." Charles nodded, his own eyes glistening. "This is just the beginning, Julia. We have the power to change lives, to help others find the strength to fight." Ethan, standing nearby, felt an immense sense of pride. This foundation had grown from the Lawson family's pain and resilience, becoming a beacon of hope for others who face the same daunting journey. On the anniversary of Charles's miraculous awakening, the Lawson family organized a celebration at the foundation headquarters. Supporters, donors, and families who had benefited from the foundation gathered to honor the progress they had made together. Charles, now walking with minimal assistance, gave a short speech, his voice filled with gratitude. "I am here today because my family believed in me, and because of a young man who refused to let me go. Our foundation is not just about hope. It's about the power of love, resilience, and unity." The audience applauded, moved by Charles's words and the family's journey. Ethan stood among the guests, humbled by the impact of his work and the lives he had touched. As the event concluded, Julia, Ryan, and Ethan shared a quiet moment together, reflecting on how far they had come. Julia turned to Ethan, her expression one of gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you, Ethan. You're a part of this family, now and always." Ethan nodded, deeply touched. "Thank you, Julia. Being a part of this journey, it's been the greatest honor of my life." Years later, the Loss and Hope Foundation grew to become a nationally recognized organization, supporting thousands of families and furthering groundbreaking research in neurological recovery. Ethan, who had continued his studies in specialized neurological care, became one of the foundation's leading advisors, dedicating his career to the cause that had changed his life. Julia and Ryan, having grown into confident and compassionate leaders, carried forward their father's vision, inspiring others with their story of resilience. The family's journey had come full circle, each of them transformed by the trials they had faced and the love they had rediscovered. As the family gathered to celebrate yet another anniversary of Charles's recovery, they looked back on their journey with pride and gratitude. They had turned their pain into purpose, creating a legacy that would touch lives for generations to come. In that moment, Ethan knew he had found his true calling. The Lawson family had taught him that hope and compassion could change lives in ways he had never imagined. And as he looked at the family surrounding him, he realized that he, too, had found a place to belong, a family born not from blood, but from the strength forged in the fires of love, resilience, and unwavering faith. A few months after the Foundation's launch, the Lawson family received a letter from a family who had benefited directly from their support. Their young son, Adam, had been in a coma following a severe car accident. Thanks to a grant from the Lawson Hope Foundation, Adam's family was able to access specialized care that had once been out of reach. The letter was read aloud at one of the Foundation's events, Julia's voice cracking as she shared Adam's journey with those in attendance. "Because of the Foundation, our son received a treatment that brought him back to us," she read, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Lawson family, for giving us hope when we had none left." As Julia finished, the room erupted into applause. Charles, his heart full of pride and gratitude, looked at each member of his family. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of purpose, knowing that their trials had paved the way for this miracle. While the Lawson family's foundation thrived, Ethan found himself at a crossroads, still grieving his mother's recent passing. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, he sat in the quiet of the Foundation office, staring at a framed photograph of his mother he kept on his desk. "Mom," he whispered, a smile breaking through his sadness, "you taught me to keep going, no matter what. And I promise, I'll honor you by giving others the same love and care you showed me." The memory of his mother's quiet strength became a guiding light for him, reinforcing his commitment to the Foundation. With renewed purpose, Ethan approached Julia the next day with a proposal to expand their outreach programs, dedicating resources to provide emotional support for families going through similar losses. Julia, deeply moved by his dedication, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Ethan, you are the heart of this foundation. Your mother would be so proud." Inspired by his family's journey and Ethan's example, Ryan dedicated himself to community service, volunteering at hospitals and speaking at events to raise awareness for coma recovery and family support. He found a new purpose in sharing his experiences, using his voice to remind others of the power of perseverance. At one event, he met a young man whose father was recovering from a severe accident. The man shared his struggles with Ryan, who listened with empathy, offering advice on how to support his father through the difficult recovery process. "Don't give up on him," Ryan said, his voice filled with the hard-won wisdom of his own journey. "Even in the darkest moments, hold on to the hope that he's still with you." The young man thanked him, his eyes brimming with gratitude. Ryan left that night feeling a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that he was able to pass on the support that had carried him through his own father's recovery. As the anniversary of Charles's recovery approached, Julia decided to organize a special tribute in honor of her father's resilience and the impact he had made on the Foundation's work. The Lawson Hope Foundation hosted a gala event, gathering supporters, medical professionals, and families who had benefited from their programs. The event included a slideshow of patients who had received support, each story a testament to the Foundation's mission. Charles, moved to tears by the testimonials, thanked each family personally, sharing in the triumphs and struggles they had faced. Standing at the podium, Julia addressed the audience with a heartfelt speech. "This foundation began with one act of hope, the hope that our father would come back to us. Today, that hope has grown into a mission that reaches far beyond our family." She turned to Ethan, acknowledging his role with a grateful smile. "Ethan, you were there for us when we needed you most. This foundation wouldn't exist without you, and we're proud to call you part of our family." The audience applauded, and Ethan, visibly humbled, felt a profound sense of belonging. The Lawson family had become more than his patients. They had become his second family. With the success of the foundation and Charles's continuing recovery, Ethan felt a calling to further his education and specialize in neurological rehabilitation. He shared this decision with the Lawson family over dinner one evening, explaining his desire to expand the foundation's reach and help others through more advanced treatments. Charles, his voice filled with pride, responded, "Ethan, you have a gift. You've given so much to this family. We're excited to see where this next step takes you, and you'll always have our support." The family embraced Ethan, knowing that his journey with them was transforming into something bigger. The experience had changed all of them, deepening their bond and inspiring them to continue their work with renewed passion. As the years passed, the Lawson Hope Foundation grew into one of the most respected organizations for neurological research and family support. Julia and Ryan, guided by their father's legacy, continued to expand their programs. Each new family, they helped a reminder of the trials that had brought them together. Charles, who had regained much of his former strength, remained active in the foundation's work, serving as a living testament to the power of hope and the strength of family. He often shared his story with patients and their families, offering encouragement and wisdom from his own journey. Ethan, who had returned after completing his studies, rejoined the foundation as its director of rehabilitation, overseeing a team of dedicated professionals. His work brought him full circle, allowing him to give back to the community that had supported him during his own struggles. In a final gesture of gratitude, Charles dedicated a new wing of the foundation headquarters in memory of Ethan's mother, honoring her as the inspiration behind Ethan's compassion and dedication. On a bright, sunny afternoon, the Lawson family gathered in the garden of the foundation's headquarters to celebrate the anniversary of Charles's recovery. Surrounded by friends, family, and supporters, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Julia raised a glass, her voice filled with emotion as she addressed her family and friends. "We are here today because of the love, faith, and resilience that carried us through the hardest times. Thank you to everyone who stood by us. And thank you, Ethan, for never giving up on my father. You reminded us of the power of hope when we needed it most." Ethan, moved by her words, lifted his glass in return. "To the Lawson family, and to all the families who fight every day for their loved ones, may we continue to bring hope and healing to those who need it." They toasted to their shared journey, each of them profoundly grateful for the bonds that had been forged through adversity. The foundation, the lives they had touched, and the hope they had given to others would remain their lasting legacy, a legacy that would inspire future generations. As the Lawson family's journey of resilience and hope ends, we're reminded of the incredible power of compassion, unity, and perseverance. If this story moved you, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit. Stay tuned for our next inspiring narrative, one that's sure to touch your heart and uplift your day. Don't miss out. Click the subscribe button now, and together, let's continue to share stories of courage and hope. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.